Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear and see me okay. Welcome to episode 9 of the Text for Text Connect Zoom Lunch and Learn series addressing youth loneliness, generously sponsored today by Cigna. I would like to take a moment to Lamont Thomas on our board, Michael Hankinson of Cigna, and then Dr. Lustig, of course, from Cigna for making this event happen. And so before we get started today, just a couple of housekeeping items. After a brief presentation by Dr. Lustig, we will go into some time for discussion and then Q&A from the audience. And so please at this time type your questions into the Q&A, not the chat box. And this recording will be available and sent out after the event today. We have a few questions for those of you in the audience today, so we are going to go ahead and launch a poll, and then I'm going to do an introduction for our speaker today as we get started. And so for those of you who may be new to Text for Text, we are a research and advocacy organization with a mission to protect children from trauma, abuse, and neglect, and help their families thrive. And so there's no doubt that at this time we have been presented with a lot of challenges for all families. And one of the most important and frequent questions and challenges raised to our organization over the last 6 months has really been around how to support youth and teenagers during this time. And so we are incredibly grateful to have Dr. Stuart Lustig with us today, Senior Medical Director at Cigna and a board certified child psychiatrist. Prior to his current role, Dr. Lustig was a lead medical director for child and adolescent care for Cigna's behavioral health business. And he has led incredible research efforts on such topics. And so Dr. Lustig will share with you what he has learned about our youth and parenting youth during a time in which an epidemic and a pandemic really collide. And so Dr. Lustig, I'm going to give folks just a few more minutes to take their poll. But if you want to go ahead and jump on with your video and do your introduction, it is over to you.
Great, thank you. And looks like I'll need permission to start my video, which I'm happy to do. Okay, there we go. All right, whoops, let me get the rest of me up there. Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you all today. And we have a significant topic to discuss. There's a loneliness epidemic in this country, and then there is a COVID pandemic, as you all know, which is affecting our ability to learn, students' ability to learn in particular. And so I'd like to talk about how we really navigate the intersection of those two very significant happenings in our life right now. And so on the next slide, what I'll start with is just to jump right in. Our interest in loneliness at Cigna has been part of an ongoing thought leadership journey as we talk about it in our organization. And it starts really with our holistic approach to health. The body and mind are inextricably linked, as everyone on this call knows. When something is stressing us out emotionally, it affects us physically. And when something is ailing us physically, we certainly take it to heart emotionally as well. And so the extent to which we can positively impact body and mind is going to be good for the whole person. Now, loneliness is something that is related to both body and mind. On the next slide, loneliness is really our ability or the desire to have different kinds of contacts or more contacts, more meaningful contacts with people, social connections than we may currently have. And it's not abnormal to be lonely at different times in our life, but we wanted to understand just how lonely people were in the United States because, in fact, folks who are lonely tend to be more depressed, more anxious, and they also have physical ailments as well in greater number. And so body and mind are impacted by loneliness, and so Cigna set out to conduct a study of loneliness in the United States. We've done 2 of these, actually. The first one was back in 2018. We used a standardized rating scale with a 20-question response panel, and 43 or higher is considered lonely on this scale. And so let's take a look at the next slide. I'd like to share with you now some of the findings of that. And remember, this was pre-COVID, so this is before any of us had to socially distance or isolate or quarantine or shelter in place or any of that kind of stuff. This was pre-COVID, and even at that time, we found that more respondents than not, greater than 50%, had some degree of loneliness that they were living with at the point in time that we surveyed them, 43 or higher. So that we thought was a bit startling. We dug a little bit deeper, and I'll show you on the next slide what we found. And that is the impact of age. And what I'm showing you here actually is both cohorts, because the findings were so robust the first time and then repeated in the second study, which focused on workers specifically, so people up to ages 65. What we found was remarkable. To a generation, every single older generation was less lonely than the one before. So those with the highest loneliness scores, 48, 49, that's what those numbers are, is the loneliness scores. The higher scorers were younger. So the Gen Zs were the loneliest of all the people that we studied. Now, the next thing we looked at was social media. And what we found initially, there's a bit more unpacking to do here, but the initial read was that social media didn't seem to have much of an impact. We see a lot of people on their phones, on Facebook, on other platforms, and yet, you know, whether you were using more or whether you were using less, didn't seem to impact loneliness. Now, what we actually know is that there are some nuances. It depends which platform you are using, and if you are using a more text-based platform as opposed to one where you can look at pictures and things like that, or send messages such as Facebook, you're probably going to be a little bit lonelier. And we also found in the second survey that people who identify themselves as using too much social media or were very heavy users were likelier to be lonely. So that was a bit different from this initial study where it was kind of a wash overall. Next slide, please. So this is so that's the background on where we are with loneliness. So this is a real issue in our country. It's affecting a number of people. And now we have kids largely being homeschooled. So let's talk about some of the challenges for kids on the next slide. And so I'd like to shift to the challenges of e-learning. Let's remember that there are some 55 million school children in this country right now, and many of them are trying to manage learning at home, as are their parents, as are teachers who are struggling mightily. There have been many studies that have shown an increase in psychiatric illness or stress in recent months. And so there's the Kaiser Family Foundation showing that sheltering in place is stressful. We have a couple of CDC surveys showing that people are more stressed and anxious. At Cigna's Express Scripts, our own data shows that antidepressants, anxiolytics, or anti-anxiety medications, as well as medications for sleeping, those all went up markedly in the early days of this pandemic back in March compared to January and February before. So there's a real this pandemic is affecting people. Let there be no doubt about it. And that's also true for substance use as well. We know people are buying more alcohol. We know they are drinking more from recent studies, and we know that there are more overdoses, lethal overdoses as well on all types of drugs. Kids in particular, these are the same kids that are dealing with homeschooling, e-learning right now. There's been an increase in suicidal thinking. We know that guns are largely responsible for successful youth suicides. They're certainly not the main choice for attempters, but for lethal suicides, guns are largely responsible, and gun purchases have doubled as well in recent months. So this is the environment that we are functioning in right now. Let's go on. We've heard a lot about the digital divide, and this refers to the inadequate availability of what you need to get online. And what do you need to get online? Well, you need a device. You need a phone or a tablet or a laptop or a PC, something like that, and you need a good internet connection. And up to 30% of people, up to 30% of kids don't have those things. And even for families that do have a device or a couple of devices, what if you have 2 or 3 or 4 kids? It's not really practical to be sharing devices, even if you do have an internet connection, to be able to access learning remotely. So some real challenges, and these are impacting kids of color and Latino kids in particular. We've talked a lot about how COVID has shown the divide in our country between those who, with some significant impediments to accessing care, the social determinants of health, and I think there are some social determinants of education as well, and we're seeing the impact here, not only in terms of access to what you need, but ultimately the ability to engage. And so kids, if you don't have the access, you're not going to be able to engage with learning. You're more likely to drop off, drop out, and that has long-term impacts, of course. So significant impacts down the road. Next slide. So I'd like to shift to, well, what do we do about all of this? It's important to remember that kids are nervous about going back to school anyway. Teachers always have a certain amount of excitement, but also anxiety as well. Some of that is normal. What's challenging this year for teachers is that as opposed to March, on March 13th, when many schools closed down, at least at that time, teachers knew their kids. They knew who was in their classroom, and they knew who was at risk already, and they knew who required special outreach. Come August or September, as schools reopened, unless teachers were looping around and had the same classroom, they didn't know most of the kids. So it's been a real challenge for teachers. So here are some of the other things that teachers worry about. And, it's been tough for them just to keep kids engaged, to keep kids online, to solve technical glitches and problems and things of that nature that they're learning about for the first time too. So very different experience for teachers as well as kids. Next, please. So how do we be more resilient? These are unprecedented times, as everybody knows. There's a certain amount of ambiguity about what's happening, and although that makes us uncomfortable, we can at least recognize that, we're not going to know everything, we're not going to solve everything, and this gets to the bumps in the road. Some of those things we're just going to have to be cognitively a little bit more flexible about. And so, for example, for those of you who are parents or no parents with kids at home, it may have been before that you could go to work, your kid would go to school. Now, if you're fortunate to have a job, you are trying to balance work and child rearing, and you're an educator as well now, keeping your kids engaged with school. And the house is just not going to be as clean as it might have been before, or the food that you make or maybe order may not be quite as healthy. There's certain things they're going to have to give. So you have to focus on what you can control, because if you focus on what you can't control, it's going to be that much more stressful. We've all been through change in the past. Nothing like this perhaps, but we've all endured tough times in our lives, and we have to pull on those resources that have helped us to get through those tough times, and to remember that we have, in fact, been able to navigate some difficult challenges in the past. So next. So part of what we can do is preparing our kids to keep enduring at this point. Kids really look to parents for how to interpret the world, and so no parent is going to be functioning as well as they were before. There's just too much on our plates at this point. But what we can do is at least try to maintain as positive a mindset as possible, and also to prep as much as possible. So talk about what we can do. Talk about what's going to stay the same. Talk about what's going to be different, and how we're going to include everything we need to do, whether it's sleep, whether it's homework, whether it's mealtime, time with family. So preparation for this recognizing that we can't prepare for everything because we don't know necessarily everything that's coming, but we can do our very best to prepare. So that's going to be key, and that's going to also help kids to relax a bit. And when you have a more relaxed kid, that's also going to help them to be able to function as optimally as possible given the circumstances. Next, please. So some of you may be in a school environment where kids are back in school. And here it's important to remember that it's going to be a little bit different. The classrooms may be organized differently. There may be more outside teaching. There may be teaching that doesn't happen every day in person. There will be impacts in order to keep kids safe, whether it's expectations around hand washing or mask wearing or social distancing, all of the things that we know can help to reduce the spread of COVID. These things are being built into classrooms where there is in-person classroom learning. So again, preparing your kid, preparing yourself, keeping the lines of communication open with counselors, with administrators, with nurses. Now for schools that are currently engaged in e-learning, there's some interesting upsides. So counselors, for example, are working with kids remotely, and it's not quite so obvious when they are pulling a kid out of the class as it was before because it's all online and kids may be in breakout sessions and so forth. But it is going to be a little bit different whether kids are at home or whether they are in school. Next, please. So here again with e-learning, one of the challenges is going to be technology. It is expected that it's not going to run as smoothly as possible. I've been on back-to-back meetings this morning. One of them had a glitch with being able to see someone on camera. Even at the beginning of today's meeting, I had to make sure I could turn on my camera appropriately. That kind of stuff just happens. Now, fortunately, we're all adults. We have relatively higher frustration tolerances than kids, and more importantly, we're just more familiar with technology in many cases. Not all cases, but some kids are quite adept at it. But kids are going to look to us and to their teachers to help solve those unavoidable glitches that come up, particularly in areas where the internet is not as reliable as it might be in some areas. So the other part of distance learning is we still need to stay connected with each other. We really do. And so we have to figure out ways to do that safely. Some of that may be online. I can tell you with my 4-year-old daughter, what we're working on is how do we get together with people in person, but at a safe distance. And probably many of you are thinking about that as well if you have kids or for yourselves. So of course there's the virtual happy hour, but wouldn't it be nice to actually sit with someone if you could at a safe distance and see them in real time, even if you can't give them a hug, which you would normally do. So those kinds of things are worth thinking about as well, and being as creative as possible while nevertheless respecting safety. So, again, for example, my daughter goes to a preschool that's very, very small. All the parents in that preschool, all the families, we have agreed on our ways of interacting with the rest of the world so that the kids in this preschool can at least interact in a more normal way. But if we see kids from outside that preschool, it's 6 feet, it's masks, it's everything, just to stay as safe as possible. So these are kinds of things that are personal decisions for all of us and do take some negotiating with the people in our lives that we love and want to interact with. Next. So for many environments, it's really a mix, and this can be disruptive as well. So for many kids, it's not going to be all distance and it's not going to be all in person. Here's where it can get really interesting and really complicated. I can tell you every day that my kid is in preschool is a godsend because it gives me time to sit in a meeting like this, for example, and talk to all of you without having to worry about her coming in from the door that's right there behind me that I'm pointing to. So on the other hand, if the schedule is not as regular, we have to be thoughtful about, well, how do we pull in reinforcements? We can't do this alone. don't? How do I balance with my wife, for example, who's going to be on child care duty that day, who's going to be ensure that she gets what she needs educationally? How do we pull in, relatives in a safe way, or other people that may be able to help with some of the requirements of raising a kid and ensuring that they get educated? That's where the reinforcement is key. It also involves discussions with my manager and so forth around when I'm going to be available during the day and what might need to get deferred until the evening after others have gone to sleep, or the early morning before others get up. So we're all working harder. We are working more flexibly, and we need that flexibility from our work environments in order to make everything work at home. Next, please. So there are some curricular innovations as well. Here's a math one. If Jimmy was a hairdresser and wanted to marry a personal trainer in an open-air food court, how many people can attend the ceremony? These are the kinds of questions that might come up in the new COVID curriculum. Moving on. This is the balancing act that we talked about. And it requires organization. It requires some advanced planning and flexibility. It may require even not just managing schedules, but managing physical space. So where are people going to work? I've had meetings with people who are working out of their basement, or working out of their backyard, or even their car in order to have some peace and quiet for themselves while their kids are doing something else in the other room. There may be times when being at work doesn't involve noise or having a meeting and talking, and that might be a time where you are working alongside your child so that you can you get what you need to get done on your machine, as we see in this picture, and you can also keep an eye on your kids and make sure that they're moving along as well with what they need to do. But again, it's going to be preparation, flexibility, and a whole lot of creativity as well. Remember too to take care of yourselves, because this is exhausting. I can tell you a lot of parents are really at their wits' end, and so anything you can do to cut a corner, whether it's ordering out one more time per week, whether it's that treat that you give yourself at the local coffee shop just to keep to take good care of yourself, whether it's remembering to take 10 minutes at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, to unplug, unwind, do something that's completely just for you. Have a stress plan. And by the way, if you, I'll just plug this in passing. We do have a plan for stress on our website. If you Google Cigna stress plan, you will come to our resources on stress, because now more than ever, I think we all need these things. Next, please. So helpful to be aware of when your child is stressed. Again, stress, children are naturally resilient, and I'll tell you, we just completed a major survey on resilience with over 16,000 people in the U.S. I don't have time to get into all the details of our resilience results today, but what I can tell you is we found a U-shaped curve with resilience with respect to age, and that younger children in the 5 to 10 range that we surveyed, they're really the most resilient. And then resilience drops off during the teen years, bottoming out around 18 to 23 before slowly coming back as folks go on to join the workforce and start families and have kids of their own. So children are naturally resilient. This is a true statement. But they do need check-ins, of course. They do need guidance. And it's helpful to have very open and honest conversations. Now, at a developmentally appropriate level, where you ask them, what they're worried about, what their concerns might be. You listen without judgment, without interrupting, and that's harder than it sounds, because it's very easy, particularly when it's your kid, to want to move quickly into problem solving or fixing things either for them or with them more collaboratively. But there are sometimes layers of problems that don't become apparent unless you ask that next question and then the next question. And finally, when your kid has clearly run out of material and looks a little bit relieved just that you have listen to it all and you understand it, that's when you start to problem solve with them and help them. So the take-home point is listen until you really feel like there's nothing else to be heard. Don't assume ahead of time that you have a complete understanding of everything that they are trying to tell you. Normalize difficult feelings, and you can share too without overwhelming your child that you have some concerns or some worries. The important thing is to model that you are managing them and how you are managing them so that they're not overwhelming to you as well. You don't want to necessarily let your kid know how overwhelmed you are or that you're struggling to the extent that you might be. We want to protect kids to some extent, but it's perfectly okay to say, yeah, I'm also worried about germs. That's how I would talk with my 4-year-old about it. And that's why I wash my hands more often, or that's why we wear a mask when we go out, and that helps to protect us. So you talk about it in a developmentally appropriate way. How you talk with a 10-year-old about all of this is going to be different from how you talk with a 4-year-old, and a teenager would be different still. Next, please. These are some of the specific signs to look for kids who are struggling. So littler kids are more likely to wet their beds or thumb sucking or to have different kinds of fears, or a regression to an earlier stage of development. So they may lose skills that they previously had, whether it's language or self-regulation or physical skills, table manners, things like that. Elementary school kids, you'll see difficulties with nightmares sometimes, or avoiding some difficult things, school avoidance, poor concentration, and then teens can get very withdrawn, combative, agitated, delinquent at times. So that's what to look out for. Next, please. So just to reiterate, we are on unfamiliar ground. We don't have a playbook for this. In fact, there's really no playbook for parenting. I mean, there are lots of self-help books that are out there, but let's face it, kids don't come out of the womb with an instruction manual. What most of us have for a model for parenting is how we were parented, and I think very few of us would agree that we were perfectly parented, and so we're going to make some mistakes. It's just important to recognize that, and of course we don't have a playbook for where we are at this time. So we do the best we can, but it is okay to not be okay. We have to forgive ourselves, recognize that there's a lot of grief involved right now. Some things are starting to open back up slowly, but we are, at really potentially an inflection point with this pandemic as we move back indoors where the virus has a greater chance of spreading. And so many of us are grieving the freedom and stress reduction techniques that we took for granted that are now no longer available to us. And so it's important to recognize that this is a grieving process for many of us. Next, please. So this I've talked about a little bit. The main point here, again, and in the interest of time, I'll just summarize quickly. Be open. Don't force the conversation, but always good to follow up with another question if it comes naturally, so that you really help your child tell you as much as they can that's on their mind. Share with them as well, but don't overwhelm them. Next. Structure is helpful, empowerment is helpful. So rather than talking about masks as something that make us miserable or uncomfortable, I would recommend talking about that, and the hand washing is something that helps keep us safe. Media exposure, on the one hand, social media can bring us together depending on how we are using it. Technology is neither good or bad inherently, but if you find yourself getting numbed out because you just can't look at another headline about what's going on with schools or what's going on with the election or what's going on with racial injustice or whatever, then it's time to unplug a little bit. Spend quality time with people. One of my daughter's storybooks concludes with, I would rather play with people or play with friends than play with toys. It's kind of the same thing for social media too, in a way. It's better to spend time with people, whatever that may be, than spending time on the screen. So do it safely, but doing it as much as possible. Next. So lots of ways to help support coping. Part of it is helping people access their own innate abilities. So breathing, has been talked about ad nauseum. I would say the way to do it is to do it non-judgmentally and to set aside a period of time where you simply focus on your breath. You're not trying to control your thoughts. You're not trying to control your breath. You're simply taking some time to be as mindful as possible about your breathing and let that relax your body. So if you can do it for 1 minute even, that's great. And when your mind wanders, you bring your mind back. Minds are designed to wander. That's what they do. So the goal isn't just to focus on your breath, but just to enjoy the process of having some time to breathe deeply. Next. Teens need to be able to talk about things at a more advanced level. So you're going to have more abstract conversations, not just about events and people, but about concepts, perhaps, about good and evil, about say security versus safety and free will and things like that. And teens will really relish those conversations if you ask them for their opinion. So engage them at the highest level conceptually that they are able to do. Next. And take care of yourself. Main take-home point here. Good enough is the standard. In my field as a child psychiatrist, we talk about good enough parenting in general. There are no perfect parents. Good enough is as good as anyone can expect. Mistakes are how we learn, and we want to model our acceptance of ourselves when we make mistakes and our ability to learn from those mistakes. That kids are going to remember that, and that's going to be more helpful to them than perfect parenting. So don't put yourselves on a pedestal when you're trying to navigate COVID and e-learning and making sure we stay connected with each other. Next. And then I've included a bunch of references for folks as well. So I'm going to stop here and looking forward to the Q&A and dialogue, and thank you all so much for having me with you. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Listing. We are so grateful to learn from your expertise today. Good afternoon, all. My name is Jess Trudeau, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives for Text Protects. I have a few questions to get us started, but we would welcome you to enter your questions into the Q&A function. Dr. Listing, I know that school systems, and you alluded to this, as well as parents, really have academic slide on their minds. And we would love to hear from you how school systems and parents can go about balancing a concern over academic slide with social emotional well-being of their children.
Well, I think that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. Folks are truly worried about the impact. Teachers, the parents are worried about what's going to be lost, especially for kids who are disadvantaged, especially for kids who are already getting special education services and need additional resources, especially for those kids who are at risk of dropping off, dropping out, have already done so. So these are real issues, and I can't tell you how distraught teachers are about this. I mean, most teachers I know, and I've done a lot of consultation with schools over the last 2 decades, so I know how hard they work anyway. They have an enormous respect for the institutions that they are in and the need to work overtime as it is. So teachers at this point are burned out would probably be to put it mildly. I think many teachers feel like it's already June 30th and it's only October the 14th. So that's where teachers are at. And many teachers, I think, to your question or to the participants' question, are first and foremost concerned about students' well-being, right? If you think about it, schools do so much more than educate kids. Schools are, for many kids, a form of, to put it directly, childcare. And many teachers are not only just teaching, they are also mothering or fathering, they're parenting, they're serving as social workers. When the social worker is not in the building, they're serving as the nurse when the nurse is not around, if there is a nurse. So it is a form of childcare. Schools are, for many kids, where they get their food. So to get a square meal is critically important for many kids, and it might be that they get more food at school than they do at home. And I'll add also that for some kids, school is where kids get psychological services. So, and many counselors are working hard to continue that remotely. But it is hard if there's no internet connection. And so I think first and foremost in many teachers' minds is well-being. So it's not an either or. You have to have the well-being first before you have a student who's available to participate in their education.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And I want to underscore for everyone on the line that social well-being, social emotional well-being is the path to academic success. So I so appreciate you integrating the two. The second question, I have an 11 and a 13-year-old, and the statistic on suicidal ideation among teens is so highly troubling. I know that you referenced some of the warning signs that we as parents or teachers can look out for with teens. How long of a period do we need to, so if we have a child that is in our lives, whether we are the parent or the teacher, and the child is having some of those indicators appear like sleep disturbances and change in mood, how long of a period of time are we looking for those to go on before we determine if we need professional help or assistance or go deeper into intervention?
Yeah, my recommendation would be, without knowing anything more than just the way you framed it, is any time a child is concerned about, or any time a child is expressing thoughts of suicide or wanting to end their life. And I'm glad you asked that this question came up, because frankly, I should have said it. That is the time to get professional help. Don't wait. Most of us are not trained to manage a child who is dealing with that level of despair. Because if you think about it, suicide to a someone who is deeply depressed seems like a solution, and unfortunately it seems like the only solution or the best solution. So what it's telling us really is that that is a child who has lost hope, who has run out of alternative, more adaptive coping strategies, and this is what they've come up with. So I would not want, as a parent, to go alone, to go that route alone, and to try to help them get skilled up quickly. I think at that point you need a professional who's going to assess their level of dangerousness first of all, and should they be in a more highly structured setting in the home environment. But if not, how to get them plugged in with expert care at that point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have a question that's come in from one of the participants, and it's, how do we address relatives with children when we see those parents not following COVID safety guidelines about wearing masks, thus putting their or our children at risk?
How do we address that when we see other people behaving in a way that's not as safe?
Yes, yeah, and this individual particularly pulls out relatives, so relatives of ours. Got it.
That is a hard question. I can tell you what we do in my family, because, and it's not necessarily about relatives specifically, but I'll come to that in a moment, is we focus on what we can control. And so the times when we're interacting with others, so if we're passing someone on the sidewalk, for example, and they're not giving us the 6 feet of distance that we talk about so much. I mean, my 4-year-old knows about what 6 feet look like, and the importance of that. And so I'm asked routinely, how come he didn't give us 6 feet? And the answer is, well, He should have, but we just do the best we can to keep ourselves safe, and we give them 6 feet. So we focused on what we're able to do. I think with relatives who are sharing your physical space, in the same house, for example, it is worth having those conversations and acknowledging, first of all, people are always better at listening to you when you've listened to them first, or at least when you try to acknowledge where they're coming from. And so it may be a conversation about, gosh, I suspect the reason you don't want to wear a mask is because it's just too much of a nuisance, or you feel like you shouldn't have to compromise your freedom, or whatever it is, or maybe tell me a little bit more about why you're not interested in wearing a mask. And then, got it, yeah, it is really, annoying. I hate when I have a mask and then my glasses here get all steamed up and I can't see where I'm going, and I have to raise them above my head, and then I have to squint because I can't see without them so well. And, so you have that conversation. But then I would lead with how you're feeling. So rather than saying, but, the CDC says, or, our health officials say, I would say, you know what, I'm really anxious about getting sick. Because if I get sick, then I can't do A, B, and C. And so, maybe I'm going overboard, I don't know. But it helps me to feel better when all of us are wearing a mask. And so, would you consider, I know it sounds crazy, but it would just help me feel so much better if everyone around us were wearing masks or washing our hands after we go into the store, just to keep everybody safe. I would approach it that way and know that it's not going to work with everybody, but I think you'll get through to more people if you start with an acknowledgement of where the other person is coming from, if you try to understand not just what they're thinking about it, but how they feel about it, and then lead with how you feel about it. And hopefully, if you've led with how they feel about it, they'll be more empathically open to how you feel about it, and then ultimately changing their behavior.
Mm-hmm. I so appreciate the empathy and compassion in that response. Our next question, so we know that children, and again, I, as a parent, go to my 2 children who are very different. We know that children will manage stress in different ways. Some children will express stress through externalizing behavior and some through internalizing behavior. For that, and for children that are either extroverted or introverted, what are your thoughts on within a household managing to show up for children wherever they're at, recognizing that your children could be in different spaces, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think not only does it make sense, but I think you said it perfectly. It's all about recognizing that kids are going to be different. And, an internalizing child is going to express things a little bit differently. They're going to be less vocal about what's going on. They're going to be more withdrawn. They may be inwardly suffering in ways that you don't know, as opposed to the externalizing kid who's going to be tearing the place apart and who's going to perhaps be more irritable. So those are both going to be signs, and to the astute parent, you will say, okay, this is a sign that my kid is in trouble. This is a sign that my kid is stressed. How do I engineer a break in all of this? How do I figure out how to change things up so that we have both predictability but also flexibility at the same time to meet kids where they're at as best as possible. But I think you said it. It's recognizing that we're all going to express stress differently. And look, it would be unreasonable to expect that our kids are going to get through this with flying colors any more than any of us are getting through things with flying colors. We're all, dealing as best we can. So being on the lookout for different signs from different kids, I think is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question. I really appreciated your last slide talking about self-care and self-compassion. And I've always appreciated, from a professional standpoint, the concept around reparative work that parents can do, or reparative work that teachers can do, recognizing that we're all going to make mistakes. Switching from professional to parent, I certainly have made many of my own mistakes. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more for parents or teachers that are on the call about this concept of repairing and how, it builds resilience for children and builds resilience for the relationship.
Yeah, so and by repairing, meaning specifically the relationship you have with them, or taking care of yourself more completely, or?
So I was thinking more about the parent-to-child attachment or parent-to-child relationship.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. The key there is really how we dialogue. And the reason that's so key is, from a child's perspective, most of them expect that most of the time adults are looking for a specific answer. When adults talk to kids, usually it is because they want something specific. So if we say to your kid, "How was your day?" they know that we want a list of what we did that day. What did you learn in school is a more obvious example even, right? Of, well, tell me about math class, tell me about science, tell me about history, and so forth. And so forth. And so it is incredibly healing and therapeutic when we as parents or we as teachers take a step back and recognize that kids are doing as well as they can, and they would do even better if they could. And when they can't, when they're not doing well, there's something that's getting in their way. And it's either a specific, it's some type of deficit probably. It's a skill deficit, or it is a emotional hurdle that they are confronting, and that's where they really need us to step in and have a different kind of conversation. The kind of conversation where we say, I noticed that you really had trouble just now. I saw you close the computer, kind of slam the computer shut, and throw your notebook onto the floor. What's going on? What's up? And just take a step back and give them a chance to articulate what it is, or to even think about it. They may not know what's up. They may not even know yet what's going on. But just by giving them the chance, without you jumping in and indicating that you expect them to go in one direction or another, gives them some additional space to maneuver, to reflect for themselves, and ultimately to reach out for help and to accept your help. And that help may not come in the form of you telling them what to do. It hopefully comes in the form of you working with them to figure out, well, how do we solve this problem going forward? Everything I've just said draws on the work, or just now draws on the work of Ross Greene, who wrote a book called The Explosive Child, but he also wrote a book about collaborative problem solving in the school setting as well, where teachers and administrators can have these same kinds of conversations. And so if you Google Ross Greene and collaborative problem solving, you'll come to a website too where there's lots of videos with this specific approach that I'm advocating in action, so you can see both good examples and not so good examples of it.
Thank you. And for all of our participants, we'll be happy to send out that information in a follow-up email. So we've talked mostly about at the individual level and for parents and teachers, but when we think from a systems perspective, whether it be a school district or a system of providers that are serving children and families, what are, maybe the top 3 things that you would recommend as we continue along with this pandemic, hoping for a widespread vaccine next year?
Yeah, well, it's impossible, frankly, to give an apolitical answer to that question. There's just no question that schools do not have the resources they need right now to do what they need to do. You need a immediate infusion of funds in order to reach all the students, to make sure that students can stay connected. Some students need very specific higher levels of service and can possibly be provided remotely. Teachers are completely fried, with all of this physically, emotionally, and need the support. So we're going to need, I think, extended school sessions once we are back in person, just to catch everybody up. And that includes smart and privileged. I don't mean that pejoratively, but kids who have access to what they need, to catch them up. But we certainly need it for kids who have gotten left behind in all of this, kids who've only accessed 1 hour a day or less of the curriculum, as well as kids who've dropped out entirely. It's impossible to imagine how we don't lose a generation of kids if we don't have programming during the summer, for example. I mean, just think about the regression that took place last summer when we, were out for just a couple of months. And when much of the school year had been in person, and so regression is always an issue, but certainly right now. So I wish I could give you an answer that didn't involve more funds, more resources, the appropriate time, the appropriate creativity to think about how to bring people back into schools faster and to make those schools safer, and to do that appropriately, to use other settings besides schools that are bigger, can be safer, other places that are not being used, whether it's restaurants for meals, whether it's fitness centers that are not being used for workout routines, just to have kids being able to congregate. So it's going to take a lot of creative solutions, and those are not free.
Thank you for your answer. I know everyone on this call is concerned about the disproportionate impact that we're seeing, and wants to work together to be a part of that solution. So I want to invite all participants, if you have not submitted a question and have one, please go ahead and submit it. And while we're waiting to see if there are any others, Dr. Lustig, what have I not asked you has there been anything that you would like to share with this audience?
I will quickly put out there our stress plan, because now more than ever, I think we need it. And it is simply the word plan, P-L-A-N, spells elements of that stress plan. So P is a period of time that people can carve out for themselves. Harder now, but still doable, whether it's before people get up or your lunch hour or at the end of the day. And it's important to have a period of time that is yours alone. And L is location, a place that you can go, whether things have opened back up or not, just being outdoors, for example, or being in a comfortable chair in your house where you unwind during that period of time. And A is activity, something that you can do. We're cooking more and actually enjoying it. We're taking more walks than we used to do. There are things we're doing less of, but there are things we're doing more of that are enjoyable. And the N is the name of somebody that you can reliably talk to that helps to bring down your level of stress. And you can help to bring down their level of stress as well, but you want to be sure that you're at least having your stress reduced by talking to that friend, partner, colleague, therapist, whomever it is. So, and if you Google Cigna stress plan, there's more information on this, but that's a good thing to have in your back pocket at a time like this for yourselves and for your families. I just advocate one other thing, which is anything you can think of to do to express appreciation for a teacher, I think would be a labor of love that would be well received and greatly appreciated by all the teachers who are working more than overtime right now to take care of our kids.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions before we wrap up that have come in from participants. The first is, on top of the pandemic and isolation and loneliness, there seems to be an uptick on separation or divorce during this time. How do we help children cope with the added grief over the loss of the family unit?
Yeah, I saw a New York Times article about that recently, and I don't know if that's the one that the participant is referring to or something else. That is a huge challenge for a kid. I think it largely depends on how it is done. So, there are some families for whom it was probably a long time coming, and this was the pandemic was really just the last straw. There are some families for whom divorce is a better outcome, depending on the level of conflict. I will say that the lower the conflict in a divorce situation, the better. So, it's going to be what it's going to be, but the extent to which parents can keep the kids out of the middle that's what's going to be most helpful. And it may take a professional to help navigate those conversations, and I don't mean an attorney, but a therapist or a skilled mediator, but that will help to reduce the impact on the child or children of a couple that's going through a divorce.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that focus on holding on to the safe relationship between parent and child. The next question is, would it be helpful for churches or other organizations and nonprofits to provide services like internet hotspots in their parking lots for families that may have issues with having internet service, removing some of the concerns about internet access for e-learning? Would it also be helpful to have Zoom homework sessions offered by these groups?
Love that idea. Absolutely love it. That's the kind of creative thinking I think we need in terms of additional spaces, in terms of additional people who can get involved and support the educational process. Yes, we need dollars from government, but we also need communities to join in where they can and help with technical issues, with space, even just additional adults who are maybe bringing a meal or offering an hour just to give parents some time off. So love that idea.
And I love collaboration. We have comments in the chat box already about how community partners can come together around just that individual idea. We are so grateful. Dr. Lustig, do you have anything further to share before we wrap up the session?
I just want to express my gratitude for having me and focusing on this critically important topic. And I like that we're ending on a positive note.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for everyone's time to participate with us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.